Now we're ready to build the floor for our game. We're going to use a similar technique to what we did for the background. But before we move on, let's select the background and remove the mesh collider. This is part of Unity's 3D physics engine, and we're not going to be using it. Simply click on the gear and remove the component. Next, let's create a new quad, and we're going to call this foreground. While we're in here, let's remove the mesh collider. Let's set its X position to 0, and we're going to change its scale to 64 by 64 since we'll be using a larger texture. And we can also move this down just a little bit so it's not covering up our background. Next, we'll need to create a new material. Let's go into our Materials folder and create a new material called Floor Texture. Again, we'll change the shader type to Mobile, Particles, Alpha Blended, and we'll need to make sure that the new floor texture is repeatable. Let's go back into our Textures folder and take a look at the floor texture. Now, previously, we turned this into a texture, but we can actually set sprites to repeat as well. First, we'll need to configure it. Let's change the pixels to units to 1. Let's change the filter mode to point, and we'll make it true color for the format. Then hit apply. But you'll notice there's nowhere here where we can actually set this to repeat. The trick is to go into the texture type and select Advanced. Here you'll get all the properties that belong to textures. If we scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see that wrap mode is now available, and we can set it to repeat. Let's hit apply and go back over to our material. From here, we'll select the floor texture and drag the floor texture material over to the foreground. Now we can select our foreground and we can add a component. In this case, we're going to go into our scripts folder and let's add the tiled background. While we're here, we'll also add the animation as well. So let's add animated texture. Next, we'll need to change the texture size to 64. If we run the game, we're going to see that our floor is a little bit too big. It's actually trying to resize itself to fit inside of the entire window. So let's stop the game and let's open up our tiled background script. What we're going to want to do is determine whether we can actually scale this horizontal or vertically. So let's create two new public booleans to keep track of that. Here I'm creating a public boolean for scaling horizontally, and we'll default it to true. And next, I'm creating one for scale vertically. Now, before we actually calculate the new width and the new height, we're going to want to create a ternary operator. This is like an if statement, but just written out in one line. In this case, when we calculate the new width, we're going to check to see that scale horizontally is false by putting an exclamation in front of it. If that is the case, we'll use a question mark to note that we need to return the value of 1 since it's false. If the value is true, using a colon, we'll return the existing calculation that we're doing for the scale of the width. Here we can do the same exact thing. We'll make sure that scale vertically is not true. We'll return 1, and if it is, we'll simply do the same calculation. We'll save our script, go back into Unity, and take a look at the foreground. Now you'll see we have scale horizontally and scale vertically. Let's uncheck scale vertically and run the game. Now you'll see that the texture will scale vertically. At this point, it's time for us to change the speed. We want the foreground to move faster than the background to give it the effect of parallax scrolling. In this case, let's change the X value of speed on the animated texture script for our foreground to 1.5. Here you'll see that the background is going to move slower than the foreground, giving us that depth perception. Now, when we start creating objects in the game, we're going to make sure that they're all in sync with the speed of the foreground. Of course, you can play around with the speed yourself, but let's make sure we leave it at 1.5 so it stays in sync with everything else in our game. Now, if we were to stop this, we would lose the value. A neat trick is that we can actually copy the component while the game is running, stop the game, and paste the values back in. As you can see, speed has now been reset to 1.5. This is a good technique to use if you're actually doing some debugging or changing values at runtime to copy the component values out, stop the game, and paste them back in. At this point, our foreground and background are scrolling correctly, and now it's time for us to start building obstacles for the game.